Everybody talks about happiness these days. I had somebody count the number of books with happiness in the title published in the last 5 years, and they gave up after about 40, and there were many more. There is a huge wave of interest in happiness among researchers. There is a lot of happiness coaching. Everybody would like to make people happier. But in spite of all this flood of work, there are several cognitive traps that sort of make it almost impossible to think straight about happiness. And my talk today will be mostly about these cognitive traps. This applies to lay people thinking about their own happiness, and it applies to scholars thinking about happiness, because it turns out we're just as messed up as anybody else is. The first of these traps is a reluctance to admit complexity. It turns out that the word happiness is just not a useful word anymore because we apply it to too many different things. I think there is one particular meaning to which we might restrict it, but by and large, this is something that we'll have to give up, and we'll have to adopt a more complicated view of what well-being is. The second trap is a confusion between experience and memory. Basically, it's between being happy in your life and being happy about your life, or happy with your life. And those are two very different concepts, and they're both lumped in the notion of happiness. And the third is, it's the focusing illusion. And it's the unfortunate fact that we can't think about any circumstance that affects well-being without distorting its importance. I mean, this is a real cognitive trap. There's just no way of getting it right. Now, I'd like to start with an example of somebody who had a question and answer session after one of my lectures reported a story, and that was the story. He said he had been listening to a symphony, and it was absolutely glorious music, and at the very end of the recording there was a dreadful screeching sound. And then he added, really quite emotionally, it ruined the whole experience. But it hadn't. What it had ruined was the memory of the experience. He had had the experience. He had had 20 minutes of glorious music. They counted for nothing because he was left with a memory, the memory was ruined, and the memory was all that he had gotten to keep. What this is telling us, really, is that we might be thinking of ourselves and of other people in terms of two selves. There is an experiencing self who lives in the present and knows the present. It's capable of reliving the past, but basically it has only the present. It's the experiencing self that the doctor approaches, you know, when the doctor asks, does it hurt now when I touch you here? And then there is a remembering self. And the remembering self is the one that keeps score and maintains the story of our life, and it's the one that the doctor approaches in asking the question, how have you been feeling lately? Or how was your trip to Albania? Or something like that. Those are two very different entities, the experiencing self and the remembering self, and getting confused between them is part of the mess about the notion of happiness. Now, the remembering self is a storyteller, and that really starts with a basic response of our memory. It starts immediately. We don't only tell stories when we set out to tell stories. Our memory tells us stories. That is, what we get to keep from our experiences is a story. And let me begin with one example. This is an old study. Those are actual patients undergoing a painful procedure. I won't go into detail. It's no longer painful these days, but it was painful when this study was run in the 1990s. They're asked to report on their pain every 60 seconds. And here are two patients. Those are their recordings. And you are asked, who of them suffered more? And it's a very easy question. I mean, clearly patient B suffered more. His colonoscopy was longer, and every minute of pain that patient A had, patient B had, and more. But now there is another question. How much did these patients think they suffered? And here is a surprise. And the surprise is that patient A had a much worse memory of the colonoscopy than patient B. The stories of the colonoscopies were different, and because a very critical part of a story is how it ends. And neither of these stories is very inspiring or great, but one of them is distinctly worse than the other. And the one that is worse is the one where pain was at its peak at the very end. It's a bad story. How do we know that? Because we asked these people after their colonoscopy, and much later too, how bad was the whole thing in total? And it was much worse for A than for B in memory. Now this is a direct conflict between the experiencing self and the remembering self. From the point of view of the experiencing self, clearly B had a worse time. Now, what you could do with patient A, and we actually ran clinical experiments, and it has been done and it does work, you could actually extend the colonoscopy of patient A by just keeping the tube in without jiggling it too much. That will cause the patient to suffer, but just a little, and much less than before. And if you do that for a couple of minutes, you have made the experiencing self of patient A worse off, and you have made the remembering self of patient A a lot better off. Because now you have endowed patient A with a better story about his experience. What defines a story, and that is true of the stories that memory delivers for us, and it's also true of the stories that we make up. What defines a story are changes, significant moments, and endings. Endings are very, very important. And in this case, the ending dominated. Now, the experiencing self lives its life continuously. It has moments of experience, one after the other. And you can ask, what happens to these moments? And the answer is really straightforward. They are lost forever. I mean, most of the moments of our life, and I calculated, the psychological present is said to be about 3 seconds long. That means that, in a life there are about 600 million of them. In a month there are about 600,000. Most of them don't leave a trace. Most of them are completely ignored by the remembering self. And yet, somehow you get the sense that they should count, that what happens during these moments of experience is our life. It's the finite resource that we're spending while we're on this earth. And how to spend it would seem to be relevant, but that is not the story that our remembering self keeps for us. So we have the remembering self and the experiencing self, and they're really quite distinct. The biggest difference between them is in the handling of time. From the point of view of the experiencing self, if you have a vacation and the second week is just as good as the first, then the 2-week vacation is twice as good as the 1-week vacation. That's not the way it works at all for the remembering self. For the remembering self, the 2-week vacation is barely better than the 1-week vacation because there are no new memories added. You have not changed the story. And in this way, time is actually the critical variable that distinguishes our remembering self from our experiencing self. Time has very little impact on the story. Now, the remembering self does more than remember and tell stories. It is actually the one that makes decisions. Because if you have a patient who has had, say, 2 colonoscopies with 2 different surgeons and is deciding which of them to choose, then the one that chooses is the one that has, the memory that is less bad, and that's the surgeon that will be chosen. The experiencing self has no voice in this choice. We actually don't choose between experiences. We choose between memories of experiences. And even when we think about the future, we don't think of our future normally as experiences. We think of our future as anticipated memories. And basically you can look at this, as a tyranny of the remembering self, and you can think of the remembering self sort of dragging the experiencing self through experiences that the experiencing self doesn't need. I have that sense that when we go on vacations, this is very frequently the case. That is, that we